And we are live. Let's hit the theme song. Greetings, mortals, peers, and queers. Welcome to Season 2 of Late Night Serotonin. Me and my lovely guests here are going to be talking about the wild new Republican House. It's going to be great. It's going to be wild. I'm going to give each of my guests here a minute to introduce themselves. We have some lovely theme music going on. And with that, let's get into it. Astro, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hey everyone, I'm Astrofeminist. My primary platform is on TikTok. I post a lot of random content, mostly about being left-leaning and primarily feminism, but I do also talk about my transition from being someone that was on the right to shifting more left. And if that's something that you're interested in checking out, go ahead and check that out on TikTok at Astrofeminist.
All right, wonderful. And reminder, folks, you can find all of our guests in the Discord link below and in the description link below. With that, Redneck, would you please introduce yourself?
Howdy, y'all. My name is Chelsea, most notably known as Redneck Shrizzy, which is the name of my digital platform / podcast that I host. We are an anti-capitalist, anti-fascist, anti-racist Appalachian podcast and platform that lifts up the multiracial working class organizing history of Appalachia and amplifies work being done across our hollers today by activists, community organizers, artists, faith leaders, mutual aid cooperatives, and whatever hellraisers we can find. Happy to be here.
All right. And for folks who may be joining us for the first time, I'm Lady Avalon, the host of Serotonin Studios. I am a transgender, lesbian, socialist, polyamorous, disabled, atheist, and I'm a ginger. Find which one of those you find most offensive and put it down in the comments below. With that, let's cut the theme music and let's get into today's opening monologue. Folks, we're talking about the new Republican Congress. Republicans have taken the House in what was supposed to be a red wave, but with the unyielding might and surprise turnout of Gen Z, it turned out to be a pink little splash. That said, Republicans still managed to win the House with a very slim majority. One that they are regretting deeply with every passing day. Specifically, they regretted it deeply when they tried to choose a House Speaker, an absolute national debacle not seen in the last 100 years. 15 rounds of votes to try and get a House Speaker elected. And yet still, only at round 15, when so much had been bargained away, did Kevin McCarthy, now Speaker of the House, manage to secure the winning vote. And I want to talk about that a little bit, because Republicans obviously gaining power is quite frightening, especially the new, more radical sects of the Republican Party gaining more prominence, gaining more power. And I don't want to sugarcoat it. They are a threat. Republicans have been pushing up their rhetoric on trans people, on queer people. They are a threat to Black and brown and indigenous folks all around. They are a clear and present danger, and they represent a definitive threat that will legislate against us. We have places like Oklahoma and Florida and Texas that are trying to ban healthcare for trans people. They recently knocked down Roe v. Wade, which was a long-held Republican policy point that they'd been trying to overturn for a very long time. So, yes, they are dangerous. And yes, we live in scary times. Hell, there was in I think it was Texas. I reported recently on that 5 Democratic politicians' homes had been shot up. Frightening. But there is still cause to hope. In fact, there is always cause to hope. Hope is not something that is a fair weather friend. Hope is something that we hold on to even in our darkest hours, because that's what keeps us fighting. But we do have some optimistic news. So we talk about the Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, 15 rounds of votes, an entire debacle. Why did that happen? Well, first, 20 of the Republicans from the Freedom Caucus. These are your Matt Gaetz, who's being investigated for child sex trafficking, your Lauren Boeberts, who's completely insane and brings guns into Congress, and many others who are too numerous to name. There's 20 of them. and they decided to withhold their votes. Kevin McCarthy can only afford to lose 4. 15 rounds of votes go, and Kevin McCarthy barters away almost all of his power in order to get the Republican nomination for Speaker of the House. In doing so, he put himself in a very vulnerable position, one that we can exploit to our benefit. What he did is he allowed a rules change to go into effect. He also allowed like committee positions and things like that, and those are its own separate issues that are too nuanced for this discussion. But the rules change that he allowed is that any one member of the Republican House is capable of voting to remove him from Speaker, which means any one of the 20 rambunctious, non-party loyal members of the Republican Party are capable of restarting this entire 15-vote process again and again any time that Kevin McCarthy does something that that the rest of the party doesn't agree with. A party in the House that is over 200 members. That's quite a few. That is a lot of people to try and please. That's a lot of politicians to try and please. And that puts him in an incredibly vulnerable position where the only bills that can pass the House are bills that the entire Republican Party, from the moderate to the fanatical, even though we might argue that the moderates have moved farther to the fanatical than we'd like, there's still very clearly a distinction between the moderate and the fanatical, radical elements of the Republican Party. And now there's tension, there's infighting. And in trying to gain power, he has given away a lot of his power to begin with. This is a position we can exploit. If enough Republicans get sick, call home, don't show up to vote, or vote present, the control of the House can actually flip over to the Democratic side. They have a very thin majority. And yes, they have power now, but they have a lot less power because a Gen Z showed up to the fight. They have weakened themselves, and we came out stronger than we ever have before. These are incredibly heartening pieces of information that lead us into the next 2 years. Another couple of comforting pieces of information that hearten us as we engage in the fight. Number one, we control the Senate. The Senate didn't flip. The Senate is now 51 votes Democrat, 49 Republican. That's incredibly good because if any bills from the House pass, they have to go through the Senate to actually become law. And after they go through the Senate, they also have to go to the White House and be signed. Now, both the Democrats who control the Senate and President Biden have already come out on multiple occasions saying that some of the things that the Republicans want to do will be immediately vetoed and will die in either the Senate or on Biden's desk. This is incredibly good news because what this means is it heavily limits the damage that the Republicans can do. They don't have the legislative muscle to pass federal laws at this point. They have power at the state level, sure, and that's certainly dangerous. And, you know, my sympathies to anyone who is in a Republican-controlled state. I'm in a Republican-controlled state. It's not great. It's not fun, especially as a trans person, to any minorities. But they don't have control of the federal legislative body. And with that, we can take that to heart. I will open it up to my guests. Redneck, how about you go ahead and give us your opening monologue? But I want to close with this, folks. The fight is far from done, but there's reason to hope. There's reason to keep fighting. We're making progress. And we have scared the hell out of the Republican Party. Go ahead.
Thanks, Avalon. Yeah, so you know this, but for folks who don't, I'm coming into the conversation with a background in social work and primarily community organizing. So my social work. I've been a community organizer in Appalachia since I was old enough to vote in 2012. And, you know, I am coming into the conversation from a little bit of a different perspective in that I've been keeping my eye more on state legislatures across Appalachia, specifically in West Virginia and North Carolina. And I think what we need to be careful about letting ourselves fall into is the trap of paying so much attention in Congress that we get distracted from what is happening here at home. Because typically what I see in Congress is that a lot of what they are doing is meant to either distract or divide us. I mean, political theater and puppetry at its best is 15 votes for McCarthy to be Speaker of the House, right? While meanwhile, before I was even old enough to vote, in the years leading up to 2012, the Tea Party was beginning their ascent via local politics in North Carolina. And I'm seeing a repeat of what happened a la Tea Party in the decade leading up to Trump. And what I don't want folks to do is ignore the state legislatures, because there is a real culture war that is happening on the ground where they are undercutting our public education purposefully, where they are still actively in West Virginia right now attacking our trans youth violently, with politicians who are funded by Christo-fascist organizations, restricting access to information and care that's really critical for folks to be able to thrive and live their best lives right now. And I think that will have devastating consequences in future elections and on the federal level, I mean. And I think that the House GOP in Congress right now is really just setting the stage for what is yet to come if we aren't really conscientious about what's happening here at home. And I think that what really inspires me is how much more mindful folks in like our shared generation have become. And I think that we all recognize that hope requires action too. We have to act on its behalf in order to bring what it offers to life. And I think that there's a ton of local elections happening this year. And 2020, I think it was 2020, might have been 2018. It was definitely 2020. We actually, or 2019, excuse me, elected the first woman of color to serve on my town board here in my hometown. And so I think that like in these odd years in the local elections, if we can pay attention to what's happening, put ourselves up for office, support our friends running for office, and then also hold our current local elected officials accountable, bring their phones off the hook, refuse to let them get a good night's sleep, organize mutual aid outside of their like bureaucratic authority, so that we can keep each other safe proactively in our counter organizing, then I think there is a lot of hope to be had there. But I worry that a lot of what's going on in Congress right now is meant to be infuriating and ridiculous so that it's a lot more entertaining than whatever is happening here at home.
All right. Astrofeminist, why don't you go ahead and give us your thoughts?
I think that was a really good kind of analysis on what's going on. I do agree that everything that's happening on the congressional and federal level is a lot like kind of a dog and pony show, and it definitely is something to divide and create and put our focus on. And I also kind of want to point out that that although a lot of times people on the left will do the bite the bullet and vote Democrat, I think that we do have to take into consideration, sorry, I'm going to turn down the volume for that.
It's all right.
I had the stream playing, so I wanted to kind of watch. But yeah, the whole issue with the railroad unions and that they weren't allowing the railroad workers to have paid leave and like that, and so that was kind of a weak point, I think, in the Democratic Party that we were seeing. So I think that was a really good reminder that the Democratic Party is not on the left. Like, they are liberal, and that is the clear distinction between being liberal and left leaning. But I do agree with Redneck Rising that we do have to take into account what's happening at home. I'm currently in Virginia, and we lost our governorship to a pretty radically right-wing individual, Glenn Youngkin. So, it is definitely important to get involved with your local activist groups, and that getting that grassroots movement kind of going. So I fully agree. And I also kind of wanted to touch on the whole concept of, being a Republican. And I know that we already talked about how it's definitely a party, a show that is being put on for us. But when you really look at what they stand for and what the people in the public that reflect Republican views or right-leaning views, is that there really is no definitive characteristics outside of simply being opposed to whatever is on the left or what the other side is doing. It is simply whatever they are not doing. They don't have any real plans for change or for to benefit the people on a large scale basis. So
yes, I think those are two very wonderful insights. Is the rule of politics is that local levels will be more important to you than federal levels ever will be. Federal stuff is pretty limited in how it affects people's day-to-day lives, but local politics, people, that is where the bread and butter of politics is made, and it is unfortunately largely predominantly controlled by Republicans, because politics tends to be a luxury of the rich, and Republicans, by and large, tend to be rich people because the Republican ideology favors the rich in opposition to the working class like ourselves. Second is also the sort of two-faced nature of the Republican Party. Forward presenting. They're arguing about gas stoves being a culture war position. It's ridiculous. But when you actually look at their policies, suddenly, one of the first things that the new House tried to pass through was to defund the IRS, because the IRS got $80 million in funding from the infrastructure bill from Biden, and that was meant to combat tax cheats. And we know that the people who overwhelmingly cheat on their taxes are the 1%, are the wealthy. And that's who either are or funds the Republican Party. So the first thing that they tried to do was defund the IRS so that the IRS couldn't go after their rich friends and their campaign donors for cheating on their taxes. Because the Republican Party is a party of law and order unless you have money.
And it's funny that they're supposedly supposed to be the fiscally responsible party too, but this rules package that they've introduced would increase our deficit by over $100 billion, according to the Congressional Budget Office.
Yeah, I think, what was it? I had it here, like $114 billion. Mm-hmm. Yeah, $114 billion over the next 10 years. Wild stuff. And a lot of that is due because if, the 1% are not paying their fair share in taxes because they're cheating, they are breaking the law and not paying their taxes, then the government's not getting that tax revenue. And the only people then who the IRS can afford to audit with its skeleton crew staff because they want it underfunded is middle-class people. And it turns out they're against the Republican Party is against taxes unless it's against on middle class people. We're expected to foot the bill for the luxuries of the rich. They get tax breaks after tax breaks, but what do we get? Our taxes are raised. The IRS is sicked on us because the IRS can only afford to audit us and not the bigwigs. And to this end, I kind of want to shift the conversation. What do you think the next 2 years are going to look like? I talked about in my monologue that the Republican parties, at least at the federal level, are sort of blunted in their impact. But that hasn't stopped the local levels like Governor Greg Abbott or Ron DeSantis from basically competing with each other of who can be the most cruel and damaging governor in the 50 states. If they're in that open competition, and that has shown no signs of slowing down, what is the next 2 years going to look like? Personally, I think it's going to be quite frightening. They, with busing immigrants from the border up to islands without telling anybody, just dumping people. I remember over Christmas break, a bunch of immigrants were dumped right in front of Kamala Harris's house on Christmas in the middle of winter with no one told ahead of time that those people were going to be there.
Children there.
Yeah,
Very
children.
young
So the
children. I thought
Republican
that
Party
was
seems to be in a race to be the most openly, flagrantly cruel for the purposes of owning the libs. So what do we think is the next 2 years going to look like?
I mean, I really definitely agree with you that they are in this competition to just kind of see who can be the cruelest. And I think probably the most concerning part about it is that they're now justifying it. They're now not afraid to say that this kind of behavior is okay. I just think it's kind of funny, the absolute delusion on the Republican side, that they're the ones accusing the left of being the ones that are banning books, that are trying to control the narrative, control the education, when we see that they're maintaining control of school boards and the curriculum being put out. They're the ones protesting things like critical race theory being taught in schools, and they're creating approved book lists. So, and if a book is not on that approved book list, any teacher that reads it to their students can be subject to punitive consequences. And I just almost can't understand the hypocrisy at this point. It's getting very wild. And I think that we're going to kind of see splintering factions. That's my prediction. Kind of like how you said, apparently people think Trump might be running in 2024. I think he might be in jail. I'm not exactly sure, but we do see that these big contenders coming forward, like Ron DeSantis. So I do think we're going to see some splintering on the right in the next couple years.
Yeah, I agree, and I don't know if this is a prediction or a hope, but I do think that we are witnessing in real time the decline of late stage capitalism, and I think it's going to result in factions splitting up between both the right and the left as a result, because I do think there's going to be, when they are cutting the revenue that they're able to bring in from billionaires while simultaneously slashing our social safety nets, and we're already headed into a recession, and so many folks are already struggling, and we still haven't actually fully recovered from the global pandemic, and the climate crisis is getting worse. I think that what's going to happen is folks are going to start suffering more, and I think that as a result, that's when the division's really gonna even become more pronounced. And I think something that you were talking about in your initial monologue, Avalon, about what makes them vulnerable is also what gives the sort of far right faction of the Republican Party the ability to hold their own leadership hostage. And so I think that's just something that, when I talk about proactively counter-organizing, I think that's something that we need to be aware of. It's not just a strength, but also sort of a vulnerability on our end. And then there's this PBS article I saw that I think put it really, really well, when it says the Republicans are rushing headlong into an uncertain, volatile start of a new session. And I think that's probably how the next 2 years are going to look. And I think it's going to be a lot of start and stop, because like you said, the Senate, we have one seat, which is not necessarily enough to get what we want, but it may be enough to kind of stop some of their far right agenda. And I think in the end, they're not going to be able to get a whole lot done. But what they are going to do is intensify that cultural warfare and prey on people's fears.
Yeah, and hitting on that point that we're heading into a recession. We've seen things get more expensive. The price of even basic shelf goods like beans and rice have almost doubled in price.
Eggs are so expensive.
Yeah, well, no, where I am, we don't even have eggs. We haven't had eggs for a couple of weeks. because people can't afford them, or suddenly it's expensive for stores to carry them. And then, one of the stores I'm at, their machines broke, so that explains it. But yeah, people just aren't able to afford even the basic shelf goods. Even when you're trying to spend money smart, it's getting more and more expensive, and people are not seeing their paychecks rise to meet that greater cost. So one of the questions I want to ask to the panel is: so we've talked about the dangers of the Republican Party and how they might pose a threat over the next 2 years, and how it's going to be volatile, start and stop. We've seen Biden impose a 15% minimum tax on corporations making over $1 billion a year. We've seen, we also saw him do a railroad strike, or a strike break, which is kind of bad. And we've seen him do these things to try and improve the economy. What do we think the left or the Democratic response is going to be over the next 2 years? Are the Democrats going to be able to meaningfully fight the Republicans and make progress and maybe make the world a little bit better? Or are we in for a true stalemate while the rest of us suffer from a worsening economy? Or are we potentially going to backslide despite having the presidency and the Senate? Are we going to backslide and it's going to get worse, and we're going to see the decline of the American empire, the decline of American democracy, as election deniers from the Republican Party gain more and more power, or as flat out liars like George Santos, or apparently he's also called Anthony DeVolder, gain power in the Republican Party through shameless, continuous, unabashed lying. Do we think that the Democrats, or that the left within the Democrats, are going to be able to mount a meaningful response? What's your thoughts?
I think that really the future is kind of cloudy in that regard. Just kind of like as Redneck was saying, it kind of is almost a hope that we're finally in those late stages of capitalism, to where we just, like, everybody is starting to recognize it. It's not one of those things that you can kind of just ignore it and go about your day. Every aspect of our daily lives is changing, down to the type of food that we can access. So, and I think as damaging as like social media can be, I think there's kind of a silver lining in that it is what is helping get that information out to people. I maybe it's just what's on my For You page, but I am seeing a lot of content kind of discussing what's happening, discussing different current events from different perspectives, also internationally. And we're seeing that this is something that's happening worldwide, basically. Well, I guess I would say in Western civilization, among other places as well. So, I think that the next couple years are definitely going to be pretty tense. But that's pretty much as much of a prediction as I can make.
Yeah, and I don't know how much faith I have in the Democratic Party to be able to and like I honestly struggle to even say how much, and I say this as a registered Democrat, so before anyone comes for me, I don't know how much I believe that the Democratic Party, like as an entity, which is like the corporate entity, the national entity, wants to actually make a change. I think in the grand scheme of things, when we kind of zoom out and look at who the funders are of the Democratic Party, usually by and large, when we get to folks like Chuck Schumer and Joe Manchin, like they end up being a lot of the same campaign funders that the Republican Party has, who are paying these politicians off ultimately to slash corporate taxes and undercut the social safety net. And I think that, part of me feels like the whole idea that like Biden would, pass that 15% tax, but then the House would introduce rules to defund the IRS that would enforce that, it's like that is part of what feels like, I think, the dog and pony show to me is like, ooh, like how much like do they actually want these things, or are they just using kind of the things that are enough to make it seem like they care about these things?
Do you think the Democratic Party is apathetic or ineffective?
I think that they're kind of two sides of the same coin. Insofar as, like, going back to like the funder thing that I mentioned, like they're actually usually behind the scenes, when we follow the money, making money from the same people that Republicans are making money from. And so I think the differences between them are usually, once we start to get to that sort of national level, like much more superficial and aesthetic differences than they are when we actually get down to the finances and the nitty gritty and the policies that they end up supporting. And I think when I say like superficial and aesthetic, I mean things like, oh, they'll go pass executive orders, things that don't actually, that they know aren't actually going to be a threat to those people who made their campaigns possible and like made them rich to start with. And I think that basically it's not like apathetic. It's more about like, oh, we have to maintain the status quo because we also benefit from it. And I think that, like, you know, from my experience having worked in the, and I told you this in our interview a little bit, Avalon, about like working in the 2016 campaign for the statewide Democratic Party. You know, it felt to me like I was hired to work in Appalachia, but then they sent me out of Appalachia and were like, oh, well, these doors aren't worth our time. And then the rhetoric after the election was like, oh, well, it's the fault of these communities that Trump won the election. And it kind of felt like, oh, well, we were set up to like take the blame for something when they abandoned us to start with. And so that's why I'm like, I don't know how much I have faith that like on that level, they will roll out a strategic plan that actually flips seats purposefully for the sake of working and poor people. But I do think that there's a lot of hope. Like I see, for example, there's a young woman running in her 20s to take over the North Carolina Democratic Party right now. Like she's running for the chair position, and she's a rural organizer who's like very just has a great vision and is so driven and committed to actually organizing, especially in like rural communities that are typically divested from and are the target of like white nationalism. And I think that's where I see a lot of hope, is that if we can, if folks like that start to make headway and take over some of the leadership positions in the party, then I do actually think that over the next 2 years, we could make a lot of headway. It's just about how much resistance there will be from folks who have a lot to gain from keeping things the way they are.
Okay, then this is a perfect transition to our next topic. We've talked about the great Republican threat. We've talked about their impact on the next 2 years. And we've talked about the Democratic Party possible responses, possible ineffectualness. So then the last topic then is, what do we do? How do we get involved at local levels? What do we do in organizing? What is the average person's, the average viewers? What is our next step? How do we? What do we do next?
Personally, for me, you know, I think Redneck, you're definitely going to be more of that in the field type of activism and awareness and getting that difference made on the legal level. But so personally for me, I was kind of shifted through social media. Like I was kind of on the right from social media. So I do think that there is a value in that social media presence and like posting information online, making these videos and making, you know, and those informative videos where you like talk and explain facts and figures, those are really good. But I think also making videos that are like gonna target like the younger audiences, you know, and kind of making light of of the situation. I think those kind of help too. So that's just from my experience. That's what I went through. That's how I kind of learned to question what I was thinking, kind of in a lighthearted way. Like, okay, it doesn't always have to be so serious. So I get that it's a very serious issue, but I think that people kind of want to see, like, people may want to avoid things that just make them very depressed, and talking about how capitalism is destroying everything, and that pretty much everything that in our lives kind of sucks is blamed on capitalism. That can be really heavy sometimes. So just kind of maintaining hope, kind of spreading like some kind of positive message about our side, and trying to get through to these people, because it got through to me. So that's kind of why I do what I do on social media. So that's my kind of bit on that.
I love that. And I totally agree. I think social media offers like a really accessible avenue too for folks to gain information and to gain new avenues for thinking, for themselves. And all, like, even when it comes to like what's going on in government, like state legislatures and stuff, like I am a working class mom, like I work full time, and I don't have time to sit down and like research everything for myself. And so social media is I follow a couple of great folks who do this for a living on like Twitter and on TikTok, and they just make really great like wealth synthesized content that helps me understand like what's going on and what to look out for. And I think as far as like, so, if you want to pay attention to that kind of stuff, like find a couple of folks in your own area who do this for a living. Usually like every state has like a Center for Budget and Policy kind of organization that like does that kind of work. And then, if there's something important to take action on, they'll prompt you to do that by like calling legislators or writing letters or whatever it might be. But then also I think exactly what you were saying, Astrofem, about like, if you want to make a difference like person to person and like changing hearts and minds on that like sort of grassroots level, I think offline too, like social media, and then like what I always like harp in my organizing work is just like sharing your story offline, instead of like if you're building relationships with folks, like you were saying, like the facts and figures can do some of the work, but a lot of times it comes down to like building a connection with people and like really humanizing. And so just get out there and like build relationships with your neighbors and have everyday conversations and be human, which is exactly what they don't want us to do in capitalism, because that's the antidote to depression. So that would be my pitch.
All right. And I'll go ahead and give the night's closing monologue. I feel like we've gone end to end from this night for this show. Talking about how, social media is a really great and accessible way to get across ideas. Real shock to some people in the world, but talking to people actually does change people's minds, and it's really great to see that. Social media is obviously a very accessible, it gives you a kind of platform and megaphone that you wouldn't otherwise get unless under very specific circumstances. It allows us to propagate and spread ideas and have conversations on a very wide and very nuanced level, which is, I think, really good. As for, the various different things, we can do, I'm going into journalism. I really enjoy doing the interviews, and I really like interviewing, talking to people, and asking questions and learning about people. So what I plan on doing over the next year or two is going out into my local towns and cities and interviewing local organizations, and interviewing like local leaders and things like that, and getting their take on things. And, maybe one day I'll be, a politician who's a mover and shaker, but for now, I just want to give the information to the people, as that's what I'm really good at. With that, I want to come back and hit on the theme of hope. We've talked about the Republican threat and the sort of middling, struggling response of the Democratic Party. While the Republicans did pass a measure to defund the IRS, it will die in the Senate, and it would be vetoed by President Biden, so that the IRS remains funded, and that 15% minimum tax will be going into effect, which is very nice to see. We are seeing some improvements. Of course, we could always say we want to see more. We want to see more action. I'd personally like to see more vibrancy, more cohesive, a more cohesive strategy from the Democrats on how to deal with Republicans, not just at the federal level, but at the local level as well. They seem to sort of lack that sort of centralized, organized, disciplined leadership that the Republican Party seems actually quite good at doing. They've always been better at recruiting than us, which is a damn shame, because our arguments are better, you know? While they say, hey, let's give tax cuts to rich people and screw the poor people, our message is, hey, let's feed and house and give medicine to those who are needy. You know, let's help those who are desperate. However, our message is getting out there. Gen Z showed up and absolutely slammed the midterms, turned that red wave into a pink splash. We're showing up and we're being more active than ever. We now have Gen Z members of Congress, in Congress now, voting on legislation and fighting for us. You know, I think there is reasons to hope, but of course we are not out of fight. Now is not the time to sit on the sidelines, but to get involved, because every one of us who gets involved in a different way. Some of us are politicians. Some of us are great organizers. Some of us are feminists on the internet. Some of us are interviewers. We all have different roles in this world. But when we all work together on a cohesive front, we all stand together with all of our different skills. We are the 99 and they are the 1%, and we can get shit done. With that, I'll let my guests give their closing statements and shout themselves out one last time. Remember, I'm Lady Avalon from Serotonin Studios, and this has been Late Night Serotonin. Chelsea, see us out.
Woo! I'm like, how do I even follow that? That was such a good ending to wrap us up with. If y'all are curious about the podcast or want to take a listen, you can find us on our link tree on whatever podcast platform that you already listen to your favorite podcasts on. Linktree/Rednecks Rising, plural Rednecks. No like special characters or anything like that. Thank you so much for having me on. This was a really good time.
You've been a wonderful guest. Astro.
Hey everyone, I'm Astro. Thanks for watching, and just kind of want to remind everybody that, you know, it's okay to admit when we're wrong sometimes, and that's what I had to do. So, you know, just keep questioning everything. You know, like try to keep an objective view on just everything that's going on. If you want to kind of check out my content, I definitely talk about a feminist perspective, living in a patriarchy, and other left-leaning topics. So if you're interested in that, go check it out.
All right. And with that, folks, I'm going to wish you a good evening. That's the end of today's show. We will be back next week with episode 2 of season 2. It's going to be great. We're going to have a great show for you. Remember to like and subscribe if you've enjoyed the show. Share this around with your friends. Come on next week. We will be live every week. And with that, I wish you all a good evening. Have a good night, folks.